Hi, Mark Granis here with Lecture 9.2 on Polysyllogisms. This corresponds with Section 9.2 of our text, The Reasonable Person. Today, we will try and do a small recap of enthymemes, which we covered in Section 9.1, and then we'll move on to polysyllogisms. We'll define them, we'll learn how to expand them, and then we'll talk about how we test them for validity before we cover at least one example from the end of the text here. All right, so in previous episodes, we learned that an enthymeme is an argument that's logically equivalent to a categorical syllogism, but in which one of the three propositions goes unstated. Our example was, all men are mortal, so Socrates is mortal. And what we mean when we say that it's logically equivalent is that we can unpack it to contain all the same elements as a three-line syllogism. That is, the normal three-line syllogism is treated logically as if it's there, even though it isn't. So here we would unpack that. We would realize that it is the minor premise that's missing. We would put the Socrates is a man, add that in, and now we have a normal syllogism that we can analyze according to the normal rules. We classify enthymemes according to what they omit, that is, what they leave out. If it leaves out a first premise, that is the major premise, then it's a first-order enthymeme. If it leaves out the second line, that is the minor premise, then it's a second-order enthymeme. And if it leaves out the third line, that is the conclusion, then it is a third-order enthymeme. When expanding enthymemes, we always start by finding the conclusion. Once we found the conclusion, then we know what the major and minor terms are, which tells us what the major and minor premises are, and that tells us then what is there and what is missing. And then when we expand the enthymemes, we always try to make the expanded arguments valid if at all possible. That is, sometimes when expanding the enthymeme, we have a choice to make over whether to phrase something with one term first or that same term second. And when we do that, we want to pay attention to the rules of validity and make the expanded argument valid if at all possible. We don't want to stick somebody with a version of their argument that is stupid if that's not exactly what they meant. So we try and exercise hermeneutical generosity in making the argument as strong as we possibly can. All right, so let's move on to polysyllogisms. We can define a polysyllogism as an argument that links multiple syllogisms together in such a way that the conclusion of one serves as the premise for the next. So, for example, with compliments to the geniuses at Monty Python, all witches burn, all wood burns, therefore all witches are made of wood. And all wood floats, therefore all witches float. All right, so the first three lines of this syllogism are not much trouble. They look like any other categorical syllogism that we've ever worked with. We know how to handle that, but what are we supposed to do with the last two lines? Two lines don't make a syllogism, and yet this doesn't yet seem to be an enthymeme, or if it does, it seems to presuppose something that's already up there. So what do we do with that? Well, we need two premises for every conclusion. So we need that intermediate conclusion to double as a premise. That means we're going to expand this polysyllogism in much the same way that we expand enthymemes. That is, we're going to find the thing that needs to be added to those last two lines in order to make that a good standalone syllogism. And we're going to find it in the intermediate conclusion. So what does that look like? Well, here's how we expand the polysyllogisms. Here's what we had a minute ago, those 5 lines, and we expand them this way. What we find is that what we need in order to make the last 2 lines complete is what we have in the intermediate conclusion, all witches are made of wood. If we take that and include that with that last with the last 2 lines, then that makes one complete syllogism. Well, why don't we just include it, sort of both ways? Why don't we keep it right where it is and make it the first premise of the second argument? Well, we can't do that because it contains the minor term. Witches is the minor term. We know witches is the minor term because we look at that conclusion, all witches float, and we know the subject of that conclusion has got to be the minor term. So we know that the premise that connects or relates witches to that which is made of wood has to be our minor premise in that second part of this syllogism, and so we know that we have to move it down into the second spot. Well, this is not something that's limited to only 5 lines or only 2 subsidiary polysyllogisms. We can go on. If we add 2 more lines, all ducks float, and therefore all ducks are witches. Well, now we have 3 syllogisms that we can pull out of this one 7-line polysyllogism. The first one, all witches burn, all wood burns, therefore all witches are made of wood. The second one, all wood floats, all witches are made of wood, and therefore all witches float. And then the third time, we need to reuse that intermediate conclusion, all witches float, the one that's in green. We reuse that as the major premise this time. Why the major premise? Because if I look at the conclusion, all ducks are witches, at the very bottom, I can tell that witches is my major term, and that means that all witches float must be the major premise, and therefore it goes first. So we get all witches float, all ducks float, therefore all ducks are witches. All right, so that's how we expand these polysyllogisms. How do we tell whether they're valid? The simple rule is that a polysyllogism is valid if and only if every 3-line syllogism it contains is also valid. Well, how do we know whether those syllogisms are valid? We test them using the tools from Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. The principle here is very simple. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if we want to know whether the entire argument chain holds, we test each individual link at the level of the 3-line syllogism. So we take our 5 lines here, we turn them into our 6 lines here, and now we can test each of those 3-line syllogisms for validity. The bottom one is no problem. It has 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice. It has the middle term, wood, that which is made of wood, distributed in the major premise. There is no upgrade in the from the premises to the conclusion. There's at least one affirmative premise, and the quality of the conclusion follows the quality of the weaker premise. All 5 rules are satisfied there. But what about up top? Well, we've got 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice, but we have a problem with the distribution of the middle term. The middle term, that which burns, is undistributed in both the major and the minor premise. So we have an undistributed middle term, and the first syllogism is going to be invalid. Because there's an undistributed middle in the first syllogism, the whole polysyllogism is invalid. That is, we can't actually get to the conclusion, all witches float, from what is given here in this polysyllogism. To take another example, this one from the back of the chapter, if I write all this out, no snarks or bandersnatches, and all boojums are snarks, so no boojums or bandersnatches. And some bandersnatches are frumious, so some frumious things must not be boojums. Got that? Well, the first thing we would do is try and write that out and sort of stack it so that we get each premise in its place, and we can see what the intermediate conclusions are. And then we would expand it in exactly the same way that we just did the last one. We see those last 2 lines. We need something that is going to relate boojums to bandersnatches, which is exactly what our intermediate conclusion does. So we're going to wind up expanding this polysyllogism into these 2 component syllogisms. The first one, no snarks or bandersnatches, all boojums are snarks, therefore no boojums are bandersnatches. And the second one, no boojums or bandersnatches, some bandersnatches are frumious, therefore some frumious things are not boojums. That's how we unpack that. So that's really all there is to polysyllogisms. It's not very complicated. They're just long chains of syllogisms that are written economically enough so that we can reuse intermediate conclusions as premises for later conclusions. That's it for now. I'll be back next time with more advanced deductive argument.